Welcome back, guys. Now that we did some of the initial setup for our project, in this video I want to start off by going over what we're going to be trying to accomplish before continuing on and writing more code. What I want to go over is how the flow is going to work when we have JSON Web Token authentication, where we store the access and refresh tokens in an http-only cookie. There's a bit of confusion around this whole flow, so I'm going to go over how it works. So here's the rundown. When you use HTTP-only cookies, you're going to have your React client served by a backend server. And then the backend server is what's going to have access to your access and refresh token values. By using HTTP-only cookies, your React client doesn't know these values. It just has a cookie that's stored in the browser, and it can't access those values with JavaScript since it's an HTTP-only cookie. When the React client makes a request, the backend serving the React client can parse the values of the cookie and extract the access and refresh tokens. This way, these values aren't exposed to the client. Now let's take a look at how this would work if you had Django serving your React client and Django also served as your backend API. In this example, we want to make a request to retrieve our user, and this is an authorized request, which means that we need to have an authorization header where we pass our access and refresh token. So you can see this right here in the diagram where we make this request to get our user, and then we send back that user data. The problem with this approach is that we can't make the authorized request because our client doesn't have direct access to the access token. So what we could do is have the backend server parse the cookie value, grab the access token, pass it to a React client, and then we can pass that access token over as a prop, and can even further store it in our Redux state. Then, since our client now has access to the value of the access token, we can then make our authorized request by passing this access token to an authorization header. Now, this does work, but the thing is, the whole reason we're using HTTP-only cookies is so that we can't access these values from the client with JavaScript, which keeps the values safe from cross-site scripting. So it's a bit counterproductive to use HTTP-only cookies and then give the client access to our access and or refresh tokens, because then again, you would be able to access them with JavaScript, which defeats the whole purpose of using HTTP-only cookies in the first place, because then you might as well have just not used them. So let's take a look at a better approach that we can use where we don't expose the values of our access and or refresh tokens to our client. Now what we have here instead is an example of an Express server serving our React client. Now in this case, the Express server would be able to parse the HTTP-only cookie and extract the access and refresh tokens. This means that when we now go to make our authorized request of retrieving our user, our React client would make a request to the Express server, then the Express server would extract the access token from the HTTP-only cookie, and then it would make the real request to the Django backend API server, passing that access token as an authorization header. Then the Django backend would retrieve the authorized request, pass back the response containing the user data back to the Express server, then the Express server would pass back a response to a React client with the user data if the request was successful from the Django backend API. Now we've managed to make our authorized request and retrieve our user without ever exposing the access and refresh tokens. Now we have a secure way of storing our JSON Web Tokens, with the only downside being that we have to write more code now, since instead of making one request to a real backend API, we make a request instead to our Express server, which makes a request to our real Django backend API, which then sends back a response to our Express server, and that Express server further sends back a response to the React client that matches whatever the Django backend API sent back. Then you will also have requests in an application where you don't need to be authorized and don't need to do anything with the HTTP-only cookies. Then in that case, you can choose whether you want to make the request directly from your React client to your Django backend API, or if you want to make the request to your Express server, which will then make the request to your Django backend API. So it's up to you. So this is the way things would work if we're using React with the Create React App approach, and also you don't necessarily need to serve the React client with Express, that's just what I showed here in this example, but you would need the React client served by a backend server. Now for our project that we're building, I'll be using Next.js instead, which is server-side rendered React, and Next.js is nice to work with because it has built-in functionality for a backend API. So now let's take a look at how this would work with Next.js and Django. As you can see, it's not all that different. The only difference really is that we have our Next.js client, which is React, and then we have the Next.js built-in API server, which is serving our Next.js client. And that's the only real difference. Now that we have an understanding of how this flow works, now let's jump back into our project and start to implement this flow here. Alright, so here I have the previous project we were working on opened in VS Code. So the first thing I want to do is I just want to complete our backend API, and then we're just going to test out the endpoints that we're going to be using in our front end, and then after that we're going to jump back to our Next.js front end and start implementing that. So I'm going to open up my backend folder, and then inside of here I want to create a new app, which I'm going to call account. And then what this app is going to manage for me is registering an account and then also loading our user. So in other words, that's going to be that request in that diagram where we retrieve the user, which is an authorized request. So inside of my terminal, I'm going to navigate into my backend. I'm going to activate my virtual environment. And then I'm going to make sure my database is running. So mine is. And then I'm going to do Python manage.py start app, and then the name of the app, which is account. So I'm going to click enter to that. And here's my new app. So I can open that up. Can open up the views.py, and I can start working in here. So I'm just going to close up this terminal side window, zoom in a bit, and let's start implementing this. So the first view I'm going to create is my register view. So I'm going to do class register view. Whoop. And then inside of here, I'm going to have a post request where I have self and request. And then this is going to be where my logic lies for registering for a new user account. And then in this register view, I want to pass API view because I want to extend that functionality. So I'm going to do from REST framework dot views import API view. Then I'm going to pass this inside of here. And then I also want from REST framework dot response. I want to import response. That way I can send back responses to Next.js. And then I also want permissions and status, which comes from REST framework. So I'm going to import permissions and status. This way I can set the permissions of this register view. Instead of being our default is authenticated permissions, instead I can set it to allow any. So I can do that right now. So I do that right over here with permission classes. Then I'm going to set that to permissions.allow any. And then I have status, so I can also send back status codes. Now, another thing I'm going to need is the user model. Now, in this application, I'm not going to make a custom user model. Normally, you'd want to in an application, but just to keep things simpler, I'm just going to use the built-in user model. So I'm going to import that from django.contrib.auth.models. I'm going to import user, and then this way I can use it inside of here. And then I'm going to have a try except, which is going to wrap this entire request. And then in the case where something goes wrong, I'm going to return a response with an error. And it's just going to say something went wrong when trying to register account. And then I'm going to pass back a status of status.http 500 internal server error because it's something that went wrong in our server. And then next, I'm going to retrieve the data that's passed to this request, which is going to be the first name, last name, username, password, and then also a confirmed password. That way we can see if it matches. So I'm going to do that with data is request.data. Then I can do first name is equal to data first name. So we're going to pass these values as JSON data, and then we can extract them like so. So I'm going to have the first name, last name, username, password, and then a repassword. So I'm going to do last name here. I'm going to do username here. I'm going to do password here. And then I'm going to do repassword here. So these are all the values I'll be extracting, which are going to be JSON data. Then the next thing I want to do is just check if these two values match. So I'm going to do an if check and check if password is equal to repassword. And then if that's not the case, I'm just going to return an error response. It's going to be an error, and it's just going to say passwords do not match. And then I'll have a status of say status.http 400 bad request. Now in the case where they do match, what I'm going to do is check if the length of the password is greater than or equal to 8. And if it's not, I'm going to once again return an error response. And this is just going to say password must be at least 8 characters in length. And then if it is greater than equal to 8, then I'm going to do if not user.objects.filter, where username is username.exists. And then if this is not the case, so in the case where we already have a user with this username, I'm going to return an error response. So I'm going to return, actually, let me just copy this one. And then this is going to say username already exists. And then in the case where this username doesn't exist and the password is greater than equal to 8 and the password's here matched, then we're going to go ahead and create our user. So I'm going to do that with user.objects.createUser. Then I'm going to pass in first name is equal to first name. And then I'm going to have last name is equal to last name, username is equal to username, and then finally password is equal to password. So I don't need to pass this repassword. This was just to check if the password's matched so that we know that the user typed in the password correctly. So here I'm going to do last name. Here I'm going to do username. And then here I'm going to do password. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a reference to this and then do a user.save. And now with that, I just want to make sure that everything went okay with the request. So now I'm going to check if user.objects.filter, where username equals username.exists. This is the case. That means that this user was created successfully. So I'm going to return a response, which is going to be a success response that says account created successfully. And it's going to have a status of status.http 201 created, because we just created something in our database. Now, if we hit this else case, which we probably shouldn't ever hit, but if we do hit it, it's going to have an error response. And it's just going to say something went wrong when trying to create account. And in this case, I'm just going to have it as 500 internal server error. And there we go. So now we have our logic for a register view. So now what I'm going to do is create a urls.py. Then inside of here, we're going to make a URL endpoint to handle this view. So I'm going to do from Django.urls, I'm going to import path since I'm going to need that. And then for my views, I'm going to import that register view I created. Then I'm going to have my URL patterns, which is going to be a list where I have my path, which is going to be register. Then I'm going to do register view.asView since I'm dealing with a class-based view here. And then I'm going to open up my httpOnly auth urls.py. And then I want to make sure I have an endpoint here. So I'm going to do path API/account/. Then I'm going to include my account.urls. And then I also want to make sure I import include. So now this right here is going to make it so that when we need to register for an account, I'm going to hit API/account/register. So that's going to be the overall endpoint. So API, account, register. And then we just have to pass in that JSON data, and then that view is going to handle this request. Now what I want to do is create a view that's going to load our user and send it back to Next.js. So I'm going to go back to my views. I'm going to close that side window, scroll down to the bottom. And then I'm going to create a new class-based view, which I'm going to call load user view. Pass in API view. And then this is going to be a GET request. I'm going to pass in self request format none. And then here, I'm going to again wrap everything in a try except in case if anything goes wrong. Then I'm just going to copy this response here, paste it, and then just change this error message. It'll just say something went wrong when trying to load user. Then in the try part, I'm going to retrieve the user. So that's going to be from request.user. And then the next thing I want to do is serialize this data. So to do that, inside of my account, I'm going to create a serializers.py. And then I'm going to do from REST framework, I'm going to import serializers. I'm going to create my class of user serializer, where I pass in serializers.model serializer. I'm gonna have my class of meta. Or then in here, I could pass the model, which is going to be my user. So I'm going to import that from django.contrib.auth.models. I'm going to import the user, pass that as the model that we're going to serialize. And then I'm going to have the fields that I want to serialize, which is going to be my tuple, where I want to serialize the first name, the last name, and the username. So this is going to be the only data that I serialize and send back. So now that I have that, I'm going to go back to my view. At the top, I'm going to import that serializer. So from .serializers, I'm going to import that user serializer I just created. And then back down here, I can do user is equal to user serializer, and I can pass in that user. So now that's going to serialize my data so I can pass it back in a response. So that way I can have the first name, last name, and username. So I'm going to return a response where I have the user, which is going to be user.data is how I access the data. And then I'm going to have a status, which is going to be status.http 200 OK. So now the last thing I have to do here in the backend is just have a URL endpoint that handles this view. So back in here, I'm going to copy down a line. And then to load our user, I'm going to bring in that load user view. I'm going to pass that in here, and then our endpoint is going to be API/account/user. And that's what's going to load our user. So there we go. Now we have our backend API in place. So the next thing I'm going to do is run my server. Actually, in the last video, I forgot to make the migration. So I'm going to do that first. Manage.py, make migrations. Then I'm going to migrate. And then I'm going to run the server. And then another thing I forgot is in the last video, I made a little typo inside of my settings.py. So that's also something I can fix before I run the server. And that was right down here with my cores allow origins. I passed port 8000 instead of 3000. So I'm just going to do that fix real quick here. Close that up, run my server. And now let's test out these endpoints. So I have Postman open here. So now I can do localhost 8000/API/account/register. And this should register my account, and it has to be a post request. For my headers, I'm going to have content type, which is going to be application JSON. And then I'm going to have my body with my raw data. And then I have to pass in the first name. Then I'm just going to copy this to make it easier. So I need first name, last name, username, password, and repassword. So last name, username, password, and repassword. So now let's test out this endpoint. So I'm going to test out something like Thomas Anderson. And then the username is going to be Thomas. And now let's test out these passwords. So I'm going to try something like this. Pass and pass1. Also have to remove this comma. Let's send this off. Passwords do not match, so that's handled. Now if they do match, but it's not at least 8 characters, let's see what happens. Passwords must be at least 8 characters in length. So now if I make one that's 8 characters in length, like password, send that off. There we go. Account created successfully. And then if I send this again, username already exists. So perfect. Now our register endpoint works as expected. So the next thing I want to test out is our endpoint for obtaining our access token. Then I also want to test out the refresh endpoint, which is going to get us a new access token. And then I also want to test out the verify endpoint, and finally our load user endpoint. So let's test out those ones, make sure that they're in order. And then in the next video, I'm going to continue on with our Next.js front end and implement this logic. So we're going to have http localhost 8000/API/token/ and make sure to have this trailing slash. So this is what's going to get our access token. And then this has to be a post request. Let's see what happens if I send it like so. So username field, this field is required, and the password field is required. So let's go ahead, pass in a content type of application/JSON. And then here I'm going to pass some raw data, which is going to be the username, which is Thomas, and then the password. which I can test out something that's wrong, like password123. Let's see what happens. No active account found with given credentials, so that works. And then if I pass in the correct password, there we go. I get my access and my refresh token. So the next endpoint I'm going to test out is our refresh endpoint. So I'm just going to copy this to make it easier. Open a new tab, paste this in, make this a post request, and then this is going to be API/token/refresh/. And once again, make sure to have that trailing slash. Then in my headers, I'm going to do content-type, application, JSON, pass some raw data. And then here I'm going to have refresh. And this is going to be my refresh token. So I can grab my refresh token, copy it, go back here, and I'm just going to test out doing it like so. This field may not be blank. Let's have something like that. Token is invalid or expired, token not valid. And then if I put in the correct token, there we go. We get back a new access token. So this endpoint works. Next, let's test out our verify endpoint. So once again, I'm just going to copy this, go back here, paste, and then this one's going to be verify. It's going to be a post request. I'm going to have my content type. It's going to be application, JSON once again. Then here, for my raw data, I'm going to pass token, and this is going to be my access token. So if I do something invalid, token is invalid or expired. So now let's grab the correct access token, put it into here, and there we go. If you get a 200 OK response, that means that you're verified. And then the last endpoint I want to hit is my HTTP localhost 8000/API/account/user. So here I need to pass the authorization header. So if I send this off as is, authentication credentials were not provided, 401 unauthorized, so that's good. And then I can pass my authorization header, where I have bearer, and then my access token. So I'm going to paste that in there, send off this request, and there we go. We get back our user. So we have this user, which has the first name, last name, and the username. So all of our endpoints are now in order. So I'm going to put a pause now in this video. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you haven't yet, please hit that like button. It goes a long way to help a channel like mine grow and get recognized so that others can benefit from the videos I release as well. Also, I have links in the description that you can check out. I have one for an e-commerce course that you can check out if you're interested in learning to develop an application like that. I also have a link for joining my Web Development Kings Facebook group. That way, if you want to personally ask me something, then you can go ahead and do that, and I will happily help you out. It doesn't cost you anything, so if you're scratching your head about something, then you can go right ahead and ask me to help you out. Only questions I probably won't answer are if you want me to help you build some kind of personal project, as I don't quite have the time for that sort of thing. You can also post something in the group itself. That way, other developers in the group can help you out with something as well. The group is all about growing your expertise as a developer, so if you're interested in that, then go ahead and click that link in the description and join the family. Also, if you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button and turn on those notification bells. That way you don't miss out when I release a new video, and I'll see you in the next one.